Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. The day was already dragging by the time I left the office. It wasn't even late, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the hours themselves were stretching longer just to mess with me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out expecting a message from Lily, but there was nothing. A thread of irritation unspooled in my chest. We'd barely spoken all day, a few short, clipped texts that said everything and nothing at the same time. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and decided to hit the bar. The walk there was automatic, like muscle memory. It wasn't too far from work, the kind of place where people would stop by for a quick drink before heading home to their real lives. It used to feel like a welcome break, a breather between the grind of the office and the quiet at home. But lately, everything felt off. Like the rhythm was wrong, like I was missing some essential beat that everyone else could still hear. The bar wasn't crowded, just the regulars, couples chatting, a few groups laughing over something I couldn't care less about. I slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey. The bartender gave me a nod, like he knew me, but we weren't friends. Just faces in the same place at the same time. The glass clinked down in front of me, and I took a sip, feeling the burn crawl down my throat. I pulled out my phone again. Still no message from Lily. A month ago, she'd text me throughout the day. Little things like what she had for lunch or asking how my meetings went. It wasn't anything major, but it was us. Now it felt like she couldn't be bothered, like she was going through the motions. At first, I brushed it off. People get tired, right? Stressed. Life happens. But the more I thought about it, the more the little things started piling up in my mind. The way she'd started staying late at work. The way she avoided my gaze when we ate dinner. She said it was just deadlines, the pressure of the job, but something gnawed at me. She used to talk to me about her day, her coworkers, the usual office dramas. Now she kept it vague. Too vague. I took another sip of whiskey and stared into the glass, my mind drifting. There was that night a couple of weeks ago. She'd come home late again, said there was some emergency at work. But she didn't smell like the office. She smelled like cologne, not mine. I'd asked her about it, half joking, trying to be light. She'd brushed it off, laughed, said I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. But that laugh, it was the kind of laugh you give someone when you're trying to make them stop asking questions. And then she went straight to bed. No conversation, no explanation. Something was slipping. I could feel it, but I didn't know how to grab hold of it. I took out my phone again, my thumb hovering over her name, debating whether to send another message, ask where she was, when she'd be home. But I didn't. I was starting to hate how desperate that made me feel. I finished my drink, left a tip on the counter, and walked out into the night. The streets were quieter now, the air crisp and cool. I walked without thinking, each step carrying me further into a fog of my own thoughts. Our house wasn't far, but I didn't want to go there yet. Not to that silence, not to that strange, cold distance that had crept in. I wasn't ready to face it. By the time I got home, it was after 10. Lily's car was in the driveway, but the house was dark. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me, listening to the stillness. No sound from the kitchen, no light from the living room. She must have gone to bed already. I stood in the entryway, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I headed upstairs, my footsteps soft on the carpet. The bedroom door was open just a crack, enough for me to see the dim light from her phone screen reflecting off the ceiling. She was lying on her side, her back to the door, the faint glow of her screen flickering as she scrolled through something. Instagram, probably. Or Facebook. Some endless feed of meaningless pictures and comments. "Hey," I said quietly as I pushed the door open wider. She didn't turn around. Just made a small sound in the back of her throat like I'd interrupted her. "You okay?" I asked. "Mm-hmm," she murmured. "Just tired. Long day." "Yeah," I said, even though I didn't believe her. I undressed slowly, slipping into bed next to her. She didn't move, didn't reach for me. I could feel the space between us, a wide, invisible chasm that seemed to grow every time I lay next to her. I stared up at the ceiling, listening to her quiet breaths, trying to ignore the restless ache gnawing at my chest. The next few days were more of the same. Silent mornings, busy evenings, short conversations that went nowhere. We orbited each other like strangers sharing the same space. I found myself replaying our last real conversation over and over, trying to pinpoint when things had shifted. But no matter how many times I analyzed it, the pieces didn't fit. I couldn't find the crack where it all started falling apart. It was like it had happened without me even noticing. I'd catch her on her phone more often, her eyes flicking up to meet mine for just a second before she'd go back to whatever she was doing. She didn't offer up explanations anymore, didn't tell me where she was going when she left the house. I stopped asking. The answers, when they came, were always thin, hollow, like she was feeding me lines she'd rehearsed. One evening, she came home later than usual, her hair tousled in that way it only gets when she's been in a hurry or something else. I was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner, and she barely glanced at me before disappearing upstairs. "I'm home," she called over her shoulder, her voice flat, almost robotic. "You hungry?" I asked, more out of habit than anything. "I already ate," she answered from halfway up the stairs. That was new. I couldn't remember the last time she'd skipped one of my meals. I heard the shower start upstairs, the sound of water drowning out the silence that had become our normal. I turned off the stove, staring at the uneaten food, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't eat that night. I just sat at the table, watching the minutes tick by, wondering where she'd been, who she'd been with, and why she hadn't even bothered to lie convincingly anymore. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was a coiled spring, wound too tight, ready to snap. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. But the excuses were getting thinner, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something right in front of me. Saturday morning, I woke up early. Lily was still asleep beside me, her face turned away, the blanket pulled up to her chin. I got dressed quietly and slipped downstairs. My mind was buzzing, a swarm of restless thoughts that wouldn't settle. I needed a break from it all, a reset. Maybe a walk would clear my head, help me figure out what the hell was going on. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The streets were quiet, a few early risers out walking their dogs or jogging, but otherwise, it felt like the world was still asleep. I turned the corner, hands shoved deep in my pockets, my eyes scanning the familiar stretch of road that led to the park. And then, I saw it. Her car. Lily's car. Parked outside a small cafe on the other side of town, a place I didn't even know she went to. My pulse quickened as I slowed my pace, trying to process what I was seeing. I hadn't heard her leave. She must have slipped out while I was still half asleep, hoping I wouldn't notice. But there it was, clear as day, my gut twisted. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything in me screamed that something was wrong. I crossed the street, keeping my distance as I walked past the cafe, glancing through the window. And that's when I saw them, Lily and a man. They were sitting at a table, their heads bent close together, her hand resting casually on his arm. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months, that easy, comfortable smile that used to be just for me. My chest tightened, a sharp, hot anger bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. I wanted to burst through that door, confront her, demand an explanation, but I didn't. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, watching them, watching her laugh with this stranger like I didn't even exist. I walked away. Back home, I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning. There was no denying it now. Something was happening. And it wasn't just in my head. All the little signs, all the doubts, they were real. And they were tearing me apart from the inside out. Lily came home later that afternoon acting like everything was fine, but I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Couldn't unfeel the knife twisting in my gut every time I looked at her. She was cheating. I didn't have proof yet, not the kind you can confront someone with, but I knew. The silence between Lily and me was growing louder. Between. Each day felt like a step further into some strange, cold void I couldn't pull us out of. We lived under the same roof, ate at the same table, and slept in the same bed, but we were miles apart. I watched her closer now, searching for the small tells, the clues that would give her away. My mind ran wild with scenarios, each one worse than the last. She'd stopped giving me answers that felt real. Her responses were rehearsed, mechanical. If I asked how her day had been, she'd shrug. Busy, she'd say, with a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. If I pushed a little harder, asked about who she'd been with, her replies would be vague, short, as though the conversation itself exhausted her. She was slipping further away, and I could feel it like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It was a Thursday night, 2 weeks after I'd seen her in that cafe with the man. I hadn't said a word about it, hadn't confronted her. I was playing the long game, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the truth to come out on its own. But it didn't make the waiting any easier. I was on edge constantly, my mind buzzing with questions, theories, suspicions. Every time she left the house, I'd watch her drive off, wondering if she was going to see him, wondering how long she'd been lying to me. She sat on the couch that night, her legs curled up underneath her phone in hand, the glow of the screen reflecting off her face. I was across from her, pretending to read the news on my laptop, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept flicking up to her, watching the way she scrolled through her phone, completely unaware of my presence. It used to be different. There was a time when she'd sit next to me, her head resting on my shoulder, asking about my day, about the cases I was working on. Now it was as though we lived in parallel worlds, occasionally brushing past one another, but never truly connecting. I wanted to ask her, to force the truth out of her, but something held me back. Maybe I wasn't ready for the answer. Maybe I wasn't ready to admit that everything was falling apart. Lily didn't look up from her phone when I asked, "Late meeting tomorrow?" She barely glanced at me. "Yeah, might run long. Don't wait up." My stomach twisted. Another lie. I could hear it in the way her voice wavered, the slight shift in her tone. I nodded, forcing a neutral expression, but inside I was burning. "Where's the meeting?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, not wanting to show how desperate I was for her to slip up. She hesitated for just a second, and that was all I needed. "Downtown," she answered, too quickly, her eyes flicking back to her phone. "Same place as last time." She wasn't even trying anymore. I nodded again, saying nothing. My mind was already spinning with plans, ideas. I needed to follow her. I needed to know for sure. The next day, I left work early, parked my car down the block from our house, and waited. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of anticipation and dread, building with each passing minute. If she was lying again, if she was really going to see him, I'd know soon enough. It wasn't long before I saw her car pull out of the driveway. She was dressed for the office, her hair pulled back neatly, wearing that same dark blazer she always wore to work. It looked like any other Friday evening, but I knew better. I gave her a few blocks head start before I followed, keeping my distance, careful not to get too close. I was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She didn't head downtown like she'd said. Instead, she took a detour, leading me through side streets I wasn't familiar with. My pulse quickened, my mind racing. She was taking me somewhere she didn't want me to know about. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she pulled into a small, dimly lit restaurant on the outskirts of town. I parked a few cars down, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched her get out and walk inside. There was no hesitation in her steps, no checking over her shoulder to see if anyone was following. She wasn't worried because she didn't think I'd ever follow her. I sat in my car for a minute, trying to calm myself, trying to decide what to do next. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. I needed more than just suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. I got out of the car, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me if she looked through the window. I peered in through the glass. It was a small, intimate place. Low lighting, candles on the tables, couples leaning close over glasses of wine. And there she was, sitting at a corner table, her back to me. And across from her, him, the man from the cafe, the one she'd smiled at, touched so casually. He was there, sitting across from my wife, talking, laughing softly, his hand reaching across the table to touch hers. My stomach churned, my throat tightening with anger, but I forced myself to stay still. This was it. This was what I'd been waiting for. Proof. They weren't even trying to hide it. I watched as they leaned in closer, Lily laughing at something he said, her hand still resting on his arm like it belonged there, like it had never belonged to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned, walking back to my car, my mind buzzing, my hands shaking. There was no denying it now. No more excuses, no more pretending. She was cheating on me, and she didn't even care enough to hide it. I slammed the car door behind me and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think clearly. But I couldn't. The rage was too strong, the hurt too deep. I drove back home. The image of them together burned into my mind, replaying over and over like a sick movie I couldn't turn off. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was numb. Completely, utterly numb. That night she came home late, just as she'd said she would. I heard her key turn in the lock, the soft click of the door closing behind her. She didn't call out to me, didn't bother explaining where she'd been. She just slipped upstairs, probably assuming I was asleep, but I wasn't. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened as she moved around the bedroom, the soft rustle of her clothes as she changed into something comfortable, the quiet creak of the mattress as she climbed into bed. I stayed downstairs for a long time, sitting in the dark, trying to sort through the mess of thoughts that tangled in my mind. Every rational part of me told me to confront her, to demand an explanation, but there was a part of me, darker, colder, that wanted to wait. That wanted to make sure she paid for what she was doing. The next day, I did what I had never thought I would do. I followed her again. But this time, I didn't just watch, I made sure she saw me. It was a bar this time. I trailed them from the restaurant, my heart thudding in my chest as I watched her flirt, touch, and laugh like she didn't have a care in the world. But tonight, I wasn't going to just let it slide. I waited until they left the restaurant and followed them to a small bar on the other side of town. I parked the car and walked in, my vision narrowing as I spotted them standing by the bar, talking, their bodies way too close for comfort. His hand was resting on her waist, her fingers lightly trailing along his arm. It was all too familiar, too intimate. My blood boiled. Without thinking, I stormed across the bar, the world around me disappearing. It was just them, just the two people who had ripped my life apart. I grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around, my fist connecting with his jaw before he even knew what hit him. The impact jolted through me, satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. He stumbled back, clutching his face in shock, but before I could follow up, a second guy, probably his friend, came out of nowhere and blindsided me with a punch to my ribs. I doubled over, gasping for air, but I managed to stay on my feet, ready to swing again. But then I saw her, Lily, rushing past me, straight to him, not me, him. She knelt down, cradling his face, whispering something to him, her voice low and urgent. She didn't even glance in my direction, didn't care that I was standing there breathless, blood trickling from the corner of my mouth. She didn't care that I just fought for her, for us. In that moment, something inside me snapped. She was his now, not mine. I stumbled out of the bar, the night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I leaned against the brick wall, gasping for breath, my head spinning. Everything hurt, my ribs, my pride, my heart. But none of it hurt as much as watching her choose him. I had been the one fighting. I had been the one protecting her, and she had left me lying there like I didn't even matter. Like I was nothing. And maybe I was. To her. But she would see. I wasn't nothing. I wasn't invisible. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I staggered to my car, my mind whirling. The pain in my side burned, but it was nothing compared to the fire igniting inside me. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to end here. This wasn't just about the cheating anymore. It was about everything she had taken from me. It was about what she owed. Revenge was no longer an option. It was a necessity, and I was just getting started. The days after the bar fight bled together, a blur of anger, humiliation, and endless replaying of the moment she'd chosen him. I could still feel the heat of my fist connecting with his jaw, the sharp pain of his friend's punch. But what hurt the most was how Lily had ignored me completely. That image of her kneeling by his side, cradling his face, burned in my brain. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, taunting me, reminding me how little I meant to her now. I isolated myself, barely speaking to her, retreating into the corners of the house as if avoiding her would somehow make the pain go away. But it didn't. If anything, the silence only amplified my rage. I thought about leaving, just walking out and never looking back. But something deeper, colder had taken root inside me, the idea of revenge. The more I thought about it, the more it consumed me. I didn't want a messy, impulsive confrontation. I wanted to dismantle her life the way she'd dismantled mine. I wanted to make her feel every ounce of pain, every cut, every bruise she'd inflicted on me with her betrayal. And not just her, him too. This Evan. He had no idea what was coming. I began to track her movements, learning her routines. She had become predictable in her deception, slipping out for meetings or work dinners that were all too obviously lies. She didn't even bother to cover her tracks anymore, almost like she knew I wouldn't confront her. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, it didn't matter. I was gathering information, and each new piece was another brick in the wall I was building around my heart, another step toward the inevitable. Lily wasn't the only one I watched. I started following Evan too, learning his habits, piecing together his life. He worked in finance, the kind of guy who exuded confidence like cheap cologne. Always impeccably dressed, always flashing that smug grin that said he thought he was untouchable. I hated him. Every time I saw him, I had to clench my fists to stop myself from doing something stupid, something that would ruin the careful plan I was building. I found out where he worked, a sleek downtown office tower with glass windows that reflected the sky. I followed him to his gym, watched him flirt with the receptionist there as if he didn't have a care in the world. I trailed him to restaurants, to bars, where he met Lily more times than I could count. Each time I felt the same gut punch of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about control. I started digging into his life. It wasn't hard. Guys like Evan always left a trail. Social media, business profiles, the kind of public persona that made it easy to peel back the layers. I hacked into his email one night, finding more than I'd expected. Not just flirtations and dinner plans with Lily, but something deeper, darker, financial irregularities, shady business deals. It didn't take long to realize that Evan wasn't just a smug executive. He was a dirty one. There were deals in his inbox that shouldn't have been there, off-the-books agreements, hints at insider trading, even correspondence with some questionable characters who clearly didn't operate on the right side of the law. I smiled for the first time in days. This was it. This was how I'd destroy him. Not with my fists, but by taking apart everything he'd built piece by piece. I spent hours going through his emails, screenshotting, saving evidence. I found the people he was corresponding with, started researching their backgrounds. It was a tangled web, but the more I pulled at the threads, the more it all began to unravel. As for Lily, I knew she'd get caught in the crossfire, and I wanted her to. She'd chosen him. Now she could suffer the consequences alongside him. One night, I was sitting in my office, surrounded by the documents I'd printed out, when Lily came in. I didn't hear her at first. I was too absorbed in piecing together the final stages of my plan. She stood in the doorway watching me for a moment before speaking. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative, like she was afraid to break the silence between us. I didn't look up. "Work." "Work?" She stepped into the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "You've been in here for hours. We need to talk." I felt a surge of irritation. "About what?" "About us." She paused, waiting for me to respond, but I didn't. "Daniel, things aren't... I don't know what's happening with us, but..." I cut her off. "What's happening is you're sleeping with another man." The words hung in the air like a slap, harsh and undeniable. I finally looked up at her, saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes, before she quickly hid it behind a mask of defensiveness. "That's not fair," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Fair?" I laughed, the sound bitter. You want to talk about fair? She took a step toward me. I didn't mean for things to get like this. Didn't mean what? Didn't mean to sleep with someone else? Didn't mean to lie to my face every day? What didn't you mean, Lily? She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I'm sorry, she whispered finally, tears welling in her eyes. But I didn't care. Not anymore. It's too late for that. I waited a few more days before I pulled the trigger on my plan. I needed to make sure everything was perfect, that there were no loose ends. I had enough evidence now to bury Evan, but I wanted to make sure it all came crashing down at once. Then, just as I was about to make my move, I stumbled across something that stopped me cold. Lily was pregnant, I found out by accident. She'd left her phone on the counter one morning while she was in the shower, and a notification popped up, an appointment reminder from her OBGYN. At first, I thought nothing of it. Routine checkup, maybe. But something gnawed at me, so I dug deeper. I found the messages she'd exchanged with her doctor, and there it was, clear as day. She was 8 weeks pregnant. A wave of confusion, anger, and disbelief washed over me. 8 weeks. That meant it could be mine, or it could be Evan's. My mind reeled with the possibilities, each one worse than the last. I couldn't even look at her without wondering whose child she was carrying. The revelation shook me, but it didn't change my plan. If anything, it only hardened my resolve. Whether the child was mine or his, it didn't matter. The betrayal was still there, and I couldn't let her get away with it. I couldn't let them get away with it. But there was a complication now. I had to think about the long-term consequences, not just for me, but for the child. If it was mine, I couldn't destroy her completely. Not if I wanted to be part of that child's life. But if it was his, well, then all bets were off. I kept digging, kept following Evan's trail, and what I found next changed everything. Evan wasn't just a cheater, he was dangerous. In my search for dirt on him, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. Links to organized crime, laundering money for people who wouldn't think twice about killing someone if they got in their way. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that Evan wasn't just some arrogant executive who thought he could get away with anything. He was involved in things that could get Lily killed, or me. Suddenly, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about survival. If Evan found out what I was doing, what I'd uncovered, I was sure he wouldn't hesitate to take me out. And if Lily was tangled up with him, she was in danger too. I didn't care about her anymore, not in the way I used to. But the thought of her getting hurt because of this, it complicated things. The pregnancy had already thrown a wrench into my plans, but this was worse. This was life or death. I had to adjust. I couldn't just destroy him. I had to protect myself, protect my future, and ironically, protect Lily too. But that didn't mean I couldn't take him down. It just meant I had to be smarter about it. Over the next few days, I recalibrated my plan. I gathered everything I had, emails, financial records, proof of his shady dealings, and I compiled it all into a neat little package. But I didn't just hand it over to the authorities. No, that would be too simple, too clean. I leaked it. I sent anonymous tips to journalists, to government watchdogs, to anyone I could think of who would be interested in taking down someone like Evan. And then I sat back and watched it all unfold. It didn't take long. Within days, the media was all over it. Headlines splashed across the internet, detailing his involvement in criminal activities, his connections to organized crime, the dirty deals he'd made to climb his way to the top. His company's stock plummeted, investors pulled out, his reputation was in shreds. I watched from the sidelines, satisfied in a way I hadn't expected. This was what I wanted, to see him fall, to see him suffer the way I had. And as for Lily, she was about to feel it too. I didn't go to the office that day. There was no need anymore. The plan was in motion, and all I had to do was watch as everything I'd carefully set up fell into place. By mid-afternoon, the first headlines began to surface. High-powered executive tied to organized crime? Shocking corruption scandal emerges in prominent financial firm. Evan's face, smug as ever, was plastered across every news site, his name linked to money laundering and fraud, with accusations flying in from every direction. I clicked through the articles with a grim satisfaction. Every piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered was being dissected and analyzed by journalists, bloggers, even social media influencers. It was everywhere. He had no way out. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as the chaos unfolded. The stock price of his company plummeted, investors began to flee, and the media vultures circled, ready to tear him apart. His whole life was unraveling, and I didn't even have to lift a finger anymore. I'd done my part. Now it was time to watch the show. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed to see it firsthand, to be there when everything came crashing down. That evening, Evan and Lily were scheduled to attend a charity event, one of those high-profile affairs with tuxedos and designer dresses, cameras flashing as the city's elite mingled and drank champagne. I knew they'd still show up. People like Evan never let on when they were in trouble. They had to maintain the facade until it was too late, until everything around them was already in flames. I showed up early, staying in the shadows, out of sight. The grand ballroom of the hotel gleamed with chandeliers and gold accents, the polished marble floors reflecting the glittering crowd. I spotted Evan almost immediately. He stood out in the way powerful men always do, commanding attention without effort. But tonight, there was a crack in his armor. He wasn't laughing, wasn't smirking. His eyes darted around the room, tense, wary, like a cornered animal, the first signs of panic. Lily was with him, radiant in a deep blue dress that shimmered under the lights. She still looked beautiful, even now, even after everything. It was almost pathetic, the way she clung to his arm, completely unaware of the storm about to hit them. I couldn't decide if she was willfully blind or just naive. Probably both. The event began smoothly. Gala speeches, auction bids, fake laughter echoing through the room. I stayed back watching, waiting. And then, right on cue, the first reporter appeared, sidling up to Evan with a polite smile that barely hid the hunger underneath. The questions started small, probing, fishing for quotes. But they escalated quickly, and before long, more reporters joined in, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. Mr. Evans, can you comment on the allegations about your involvement with criminal enterprises? Is it true you've been laundering money for organized crime? Are the claims about insider trading accurate? Evans' expression shifted from annoyance to outright alarm. His smile faltered, eyes narrowing as he tried to wave them off. But it was too late. The wolves had caught the scent of blood, and they weren't letting go. Lily stood frozen beside him, her face pale as the questions grew sharper, more pointed. The crowd began to murmur, some guests retreating to the edges of the room as the scene unfolded. I watched from the back, a small, cold smile tugging at my lips. This was better than I'd imagined. It didn't take long for the security detail to intervene, ushering Evan and Lily toward a side exit, away from the growing mob of reporters. I followed, staying out of sight but close enough to catch the tail end of their conversation. "What the hell is happening, Evan?" Lily's voice was sharp, panicked as they stumbled through the hallway. "I don't know," Evan snapped, his tone harsh, angry. "This is some kind of smear campaign. I'll handle it." "Handle it? It's all over the news." "What have you gotten yourself into?" They reached a private alcove near the back of the hotel, far from the prying eyes of the press. Evan paced, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself. Lily stood there, arms crossed, waiting for answers she wasn't going to get. I stepped out of the shadows. Trouble in paradise? They both froze, turning to face me. The shock in their eyes was priceless. "Daniel," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I came to watch the fireworks," I said, stepping closer, my gaze locking with Evan's. "How does it feel, Evan, knowing everything you've built is about to burn to the ground?" Evan's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" I laughed softly, the sound cold and hollow. "You think this is some random smear campaign? You think this is just bad luck?" Realization began to dawn in his expression. He took a step toward me, his fist clenched. "You did this." I smiled, the satisfaction flooding through me. "I warned you, Evan." "You shouldn't have touched what wasn't yours." Lily's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth as she finally understood. Oh my God. Daniel, what did you do? I did what you both deserved, I said, my voice calm, controlled. I tore his life apart the same way you tore mine apart. Evan lunged at me, fury in his eyes, but I sidestepped him easily. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. His world was collapsing and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I leaned in close, my voice low, taunting. I exposed you. All of it. The dirty deals, the money laundering, the fraud. It's all out there now. The press, the government, the cops, they're all coming for you. He stumbled back, breathing hard, the weight of my words sinking in. Lily stood there trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. How could you do this? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. To me? To us? I turned to her, my gaze hard. Us? There hasn't been an us for a long time, Lily. You made sure of that. She shook her head, her voice breaking. I'm pregnant, Daniel. I didn't know how to tell you. I was confused. I cut her off, the rage bubbling up again. Don't you dare try to use that against me now. Is it even mine, or is it his? She flinched at my words, her tears falling faster. It's yours, I swear. I made a mistake, but Mistake? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the grocery store. What you did was a choice. You chose him, over and over again. The weight of her betrayal hung in the air, suffocating. Lily sank to the floor, her sobs echoing in the empty hallway. Evan just stood there staring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, his entire life crumbling before his eyes. You're finished, Evan, I said, my voice cold, final. The authorities will be here soon, and Lily, you'll get to watch him go down in flames. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving them both behind, shattered in their own mess. The sound of Lily's sobs followed me down the hall, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. There was nothing left for me in that moment but the satisfaction of knowing I'd taken control, knowing that I'd won. The next morning, the headlines were worse. Evan had been arrested, dragged out of his luxurious penthouse by federal agents. The image of him in handcuffs, his once perfect life in ruins, was splashed across every major news outlet. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and there would be no redemption for him. I sat in my office, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The house was quiet. Lily had left the night before, taking only a small bag with her. I didn't know where she was now, and honestly, I didn't care. In the end, I'd gotten what I wanted. I'd torn their lives apart, watched them break under the weight of their own decisions. But as I sat there, staring at the empty space where Lily's things used to be, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling that had settled deep in my chest. The rage, the drive for revenge, it had fueled me for so long, given me purpose. But now, with it all done, with Evan behind bars and Lily gone, I was left with the quiet aftermath. I had won, yes, but at what cost? I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, the silence pressing in on me. I'd burned everything down, and now I was left with the ashes. Victory. Everything around me felt empty. I sat in the quiet house, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the stillness. Lily's side of the closet was bare now, her scent gone from the pillows. I hadn't called her, hadn't reached out since that night at the charity event. There was nothing left to say. I imagined her somewhere, maybe a hotel, maybe with a friend, wondering if she was still crying, still trying to piece together how her life had crumbled so quickly. I used to care about things like that. The thought of her in pain would have ripped me apart once. Now, there was only this numb void where my emotions used to be. I thought revenge would fill it, that seeing Evan fall and watching Lily break would somehow patch the wounds they'd left me with. But all it did was leave me cold, staring at the wreckage of everything I'd destroyed, including myself. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring down at my hands. They were still. No more fists clenched in anger, no more shaking with rage. For the first time in months, I wasn't consumed by the fire of betrayal. But there was no peace in it either, just this strange, hollow silence. I'd won. Evan was done for. Federal agents were going to keep him occupied for years, maybe the rest of his life. His smug grin would be gone, replaced by a prison jumpsuit and the scorn of a society that devoured the weak. Lily, too, had been collateral damage. I'd humiliated her, destroyed any chance she had of a life with the man she'd chosen. She'd face the whispers, the shame, the knowledge that her affair had burned everything to the ground. And yet, as I sat there, I didn't feel like a victor. I thought about the last thing Lily had said before she left, the rawness in her voice, her face streaked with tears. "I'm pregnant, Daniel. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if the baby was mine or Evan's. I didn't care to find out at the time." It had felt like just another twist of the knife she'd already plunged into me. But now, in the eerie stillness of the house, I realized that this was my future, my legacy, emptiness. What would I do if the child was mine? What kind of father would I be after this? The thought lingered, curling around my mind tighter and tighter. A part of me wanted to know the truth, to demand answers. But the other part, the part that had orchestrated all of this, knew that even if the child was mine, nothing could undo what had been done. I had crossed a line, burned down any bridge that might have remained between us. If I tried to reach out to Lily now, it would only bring more destruction. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix any of it. My phone buzzed, interrupting the suffocating quiet. I glanced at the screen, expecting another news alert about Evan's downfall. Instead, it was a message from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. "Saw the news about Evans. Crazy stuff. Hope you're doing okay, man." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. How was I doing? I didn't even know anymore. The old me, the one who would have cared about something like this, felt like a stranger. The Daniel who'd lived for small pleasures, who loved his wife, who believed in trust and loyalty, that man had disappeared the moment I saw her with Evan in that bar. And the one who replaced him, the one who lived on cold calculation and rage, had gotten what he wanted. But now, I wasn't sure what was left of me. I didn't respond to the message. I put the phone down, letting it buzz again, another alert about Evan's arrest. The world outside was moving, spinning with chaos, headlines screaming his name. But inside, everything was still. Days passed, blurring into one another. I went through the motions of life, going to work, making coffee, coming home to an empty house. People congratulated me on my recent successes, though they had no idea what that really meant. They didn't see the man behind the mask, the man who had destroyed everything he thought he wanted, only to be left with nothing but ashes. One evening, a week after Lily had left, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city. The streets were busy, people bustling about, living their lives. Couples held hands, families sat down for dinner in warmly lit restaurants, and I felt like I was watching it all from a distance, as if I didn't belong in that world anymore. Maybe I didn't. I pulled over near the bar where it had all started, the place where I first saw Lily with Evan, where the seed of my revenge had been planted. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the entrance. I could almost see it again. Evan's hand on her waist, her smiling at him, the way she had chosen him over me without hesitation. That moment had defined everything since. It had been the point of no return. I got out of the car and walked inside, the familiar scent of whiskey and stale beer hitting me. The bar was quieter than usual, a few scattered patrons nursing drinks. I ordered a whiskey, something strong, and found a seat in the corner, my eyes drifting across the room. There was a couple sitting at a table near the window, laughing softly, their hands intertwined. I watched them for a while, a strange mix of envy and disgust rising in my chest. Once I'd been like that, naive, trusting, thinking love was something solid, something that could withstand anything. But I knew better now. Love was fragile, trust was an illusion, and betrayal. Betrayal was the only thing that ever lasted. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it didn't chase away the thoughts swirling in my mind. I sat there staring at the glass, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought about Lily again, about the way she had crumpled in that hallway, begging for forgiveness, asking me to believe her. I'd walked away from her sobbing form and I hadn't looked back. But now, sitting here in this dimly lit bar, I wondered if maybe I should have. What was left for me now? The revenge was done. Evan was gone. Lily was gone. And the life I had once known, the one I thought I was fighting to protect, was gone too. I had burned it all down, but I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything. I paid for the drink and left the bar, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into the late hours. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to figure out what came next. But there was no clear answer. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was what revenge looked like in the end. Not some grand moment of triumph, but this emptiness. 2 weeks later, I received a letter. It was from Lily. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I even wanted to know what she had to say. But something inside me, some small flicker of the man I used to be, made me tear open the envelope and read. Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us. I don't know if anything can ever be repaired. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness or to undo the damage we've done to each other. I'm writing because I want you to know that I'm leaving the city. I need a fresh start for me, for the baby. Yes, the baby is yours. I went to the doctor to confirm it, and I thought you should know. What you do with that information is up to you. I'm not asking for anything. I didn't want to leave without telling you the truth. I'm sorry for everything, for hurting you, for betraying you, but I can't stay here anymore. There's nothing left for me in this city. I hope one day we can both find peace. Lily. I folded the letter and set it down on the table, staring at it for a long time. The baby was mine. I should have felt something, joy, anger, regret, but all I felt was tired. I had destroyed everything, and now there was nothing left to rebuild. Lily was gone. Our child would grow up without me, and it was because of the choices we had both made. I thought revenge would make me whole again, that it would give me closure. But in the end, all it did was leave me with a different kind of loss. The next morning, I packed up a few things and left the house for the last time. The city stretched out before me as I drove, miles and miles of possibilities, but no clear direction. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had my revenge. But in the end, all it had cost me was myself. Victory, the silence of my own actions, finally settled over me. Everything I thought I wanted had been realized. Every plan executed flawlessly. Evan was finished, his career and reputation in shambles. Lily was gone, her life upended, her future uncertain. The baby was mine, but it didn't feel like it. Not in the way it should have. What should have brought clarity, finality, felt instead like a gaping void I couldn't fill. I'd left the house that morning with no destination in mind, just driving aimlessly through the city that now felt foreign to me. The streets were the same, but nothing about them felt familiar anymore. Maybe it was me who had changed, or maybe it was the life I had scorched to the ground. Hours passed before I finally stopped at a park I used to frequent with Lily, back when things were normal, or at least when I thought they were. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. A group of kids played near the swings, their laughter echoing faintly through the warm evening air. I watched them, unable to shake the thought of my child, our child, growing up somewhere else without me. Would they ever know who I was? Would I ever know them? Or would they just be a ghost of a future I had already burned down? I sat on a bench near the playground, my mind circling endlessly around the same questions. I had spent so long fixating on revenge, on making Evan and Lily suffer, that I hadn't stopped to think about what would come after. I thought victory would bring me closure, that once they were ruined, I could move on. But now that I had it, the future stretched out before me like a desolate wasteland, empty and cold. The park began to empty out as the evening wore on, parents gathering their children, couples heading home. I was left alone with my thoughts, the ache of what I'd lost settling deeper into my bones. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me out of the fog. I hesitated before checking it, half expecting another message from someone congratulating me on taking down the bad guy. It wasn't. It was from Lily. We need to talk. Please, Daniel, just one last time. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the message. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it fade into the silence like everything else. But another part of me, the part that had been gnawing at me ever since I received her letter, told me I needed to see her. Maybe for answers. Maybe for closure. Maybe just to see her one last time before I disappeared from her life for good. Before I knew what I was doing, I was typing a response. Where? She replied almost instantly. The park where we used to go. Half an hour. I looked around, realizing with a strange twist of fate that I was already there. Already waiting. I stood up, shaking off the stiffness from sitting too long, and headed toward the quiet path that wound through the park. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving the sky streaked with fading light. I found a spot near the pond where we used to sit, the place where we'd once talked about the future, about our dreams, back when life still made sense. It felt like a lifetime ago. I didn't have to wait long. Lily appeared, walking slowly down the path toward me, her figure barely illuminated by the streetlights. She looked different, pale, fragile, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. There was no trace of the confident woman who had captivated me all those years ago. No sign of the person who had betrayed me. Just Lily, broken and lost like I was. She stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes downcast. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence hung between us, thick and heavy, until finally she looked up at me. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mind was racing, every word I wanted to say tangled in the mess of emotions that had been building since the night I'd seen her with Evan. "I know you don't owe me anything," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I ruined everything, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I needed to see you." "Why?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop it. My voice was harsher than I intended, but I couldn't help it. I was still angry, still hurt. "Why now? After everything?" She flinched but didn't look away. "Because I'm leaving," she said softly. "For good this time. I'm going to start over somewhere new, with the baby. And I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." "Goodbye," I echoed, the word feeling strange in my mouth. After everything we'd been through, after all the pain and betrayal, this was how it ended, with a quiet goodbye in a darkened park. "I'm not asking you to be a part of our lives," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know I've taken that from you. I know I've ruined any chance we had at a future together. But the baby is yours, Daniel. And I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to be a part of their life, I won't stop you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had been so consumed by anger, by the need for revenge, that I hadn't let myself think about what it meant for me to be a father. What it meant for me to walk away from my child. But now, standing there in the fading light, the reality of it began to sink in. "I don't know if I can," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready." Lily nodded, her tears spilling over. "I understand. I really do. But I wanted you to have the choice. I didn't want to take that away from you, too." The silence stretched between us again, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on my chest. I wanted to ask her why. Why she had done it. Why she had chosen Evan. Why she had destroyed us. But I already knew the answers. Or maybe in the end, the answers didn't matter anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. She wasn't the villain I had built her up to be. She was just a broken person, like me, trying to make sense of a life that had spun out of control. And in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I could give her, not yet, maybe not ever. But I could let her go. "I know," I said softly. "I know." We stood there for a long time, neither of us moving, neither of us saying anything. And then finally, she turned to leave. I watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the darkness. This time, I didn't feel the need to chase after her. I didn't feel the rage, the hurt, the desperation that had consumed me for so long. I just felt tired. Days passed after that night, each one blending into the next. I didn't hear from Lily again. I didn't expect to. She had moved on, and in a strange way, I felt like I had too. Not fully, not completely, but enough to start piecing my life back together, one small step at a time. I thought about the baby sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet. I wondered what they would look like, what kind of person they would grow up to be. I wondered if I would ever be ready to meet them. But for now, the thought was enough. The future was uncertain, but it was there, waiting for me, if I ever decided to take that step. I had gotten my revenge. I had torn down the people who had hurt me. But in the end, it hadn't given me what I thought it would. It hadn't healed the wounds, hadn't brought me the closure I craved. All it had done was leave me standing in the ashes of a life I could never get back. But maybe that was the point. Maybe, sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go of the past. I didn't know where my life would take me next. I didn't know if I would ever find the peace Lily had wished for me. But as I stood on the edge of an uncertain future, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for now, that was enough.